Welcome to the sixth in our series of lectures on the history of the computer. This series is based on a documentary titled The Machine That Changed the World of 1992. It was written and directed by Nancy Lind and produced by WGBH Television of Boston, Massachusetts, and the British Broadcasting Corporation. Backers included the Association of Computing Machinery, the National Science Foundation, and the Unisys Corporation. This lecture explores the second episode of that documentary entitled The Thinking Machine. Recall that we talked previously about the invention of the transistor. The early pioneers, including the UNIVAC and the Leo, and we talked about IBM's entry into the computer business with the IBM 650. In this lecture, we will continue our study of the history of the computer. In the 1950s, the computer companies were really promoting this machine that was to revolutionize business processing. Naturally, they did their best to make sure that it seemed like the greatest thing since sliced bread. Unfortunately, it could be said that they were lying, because there was a problem with the lack of software. You realize that without software, a computer is useless. In those early days, it was very difficult to create systems that actually did something useful. Until 1955, there was not even a high-level programming language. So as a result, organizations would purchase computers that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money, and they would just be sitting there doing nothing while people tried to figure out how to program them in the only language they had, which was assembly language. Assembly language or machine language is very difficult to program. In 1957, the first compiler for a high-level general-purpose programming language was delivered using Fortran, which stood for Formula Translator. However, Fortran was best suited for engineering applications and not so much for business applications. For several years, the various computer vendors were developing their own programming languages, and then in 1959, a committee was formed to discuss the creation of a common programming language for business. That resulted in the development of COBOL, which stood for Common Business-Oriented Language. COBOL was to be the dominant programming language for many years. One of the committee members was Rear Admiral Grace Hopper. She had written a language called Flowmatic for the Remington Rand's UNIVAC. Although COBOL was a committee effort, most give credit to Admiral Hopper and her Flowmatic as being the origins of COBOL. In fact, I have heard her referred to as Grandma COBOL. Admiral Hopper retired from the Navy in 1966, but because of her knowledge, she was recalled to active duty at age 60. When she retired in 1986 at age 79, she was a Rear Admiral as well as being the oldest serving officer in the service. The companies that we have discussed previously were not the only players in the 1950s and 60s. GE, Burroughs, and others also were at work in the new industry. The Irma Mark II was introduced by GE in 1955. IRMA was an acronym for the Electronic Recording Method of Accounting. It was actually developed by Stanford Research. We'll talk more about Stanford Research in future lectures on the internet. Notice who the spokesman for IRMA was in the Thinking Machine episode. I hope everyone recognizes him. The next great hardware milestone in the evolution of the computer was the integrated circuit. You'll recall that the transistor was a huge improvement over the vacuum tube. It was a lot faster and generated no heat. However, there were still problems associated with it, primarily the amount of wiring it took to connect all those transistors together. It was referred to as the tyranny of numbers. The integrated circuit combined multiple transistors into a single silicon chip, greatly improving the situation. Interestingly enough, though, they didn't sell well at first, primarily because of cost. These things were expensive. Then this happened. In October of 1957, the Soviet Union put the world's first satellite called Sputnik into space. Let's go to the NASA site and see what they have to say about it. History changed on October the 4th, 1957, when the Soviet Union successfully launched Sputnik 1. The world's first artificial satellite was about the size of a beach ball, weighed 183.9 pounds, and took about 98 minutes to orbit the Earth on its elliptical path. That launch ushered in new political, military, technological, and scientific achievements. While the Sputnik launch was a single event, it marked the start of the space age and the US-USSR space race. And here's what they heard the night Sputnik flew over. All this marked the beginning of the space race. On May the 25th, 1961, in this speech before a joint session of Congress, President John Kennedy stated that the United States should set as a goal the landing of a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth by the end of the decade. In order to do this, we would need a computer on a spacecraft. That meant we would have to find a way to reduce the size of a computer dramatically, which meant using integrated circuits. Because of all the development of technology related to the space race, cost of integrated circuits began to drop as the demand increased. These two men are credited with inventing the integrated circuit, even though they did their work separately. They were Jack Kilby of Texas Instruments and Robert Noyce of Fairfield Semiconductor. Here's a speech made by Jack Kilby when he was awarded the Nobel Prize. Here he says, "I would like to mention another right person at the right time, namely Robert Noyce, a contemporary of mine who worked at Fairfield Semiconductor." Well, Robert Noyce didn't just work at Fairfield Semiconductor, he was one of the co-founders. While Robert and I followed our own paths, we worked hard together to achieve commercial acceptance of the integrated circuits. If he were still living, I have no doubt we would have shared this prize. And that is correct. They were both recognized as having created the integrated circuit. Here is Intel website. Oh, by the way, did we mention that after leaving Fairfield Semiconductor, Robert Noyce was one of the co-founders of Intel? Here's a timeline that shows him receiving his PhD in physics in 1957, co-founding Fairfield Semiconductor. In 1959, co-inventing the integrated circuit along with Jack Kilby. In 1968, leaving Fairfield Semiconductor to found Intel. So these two gentlemen were really significant pioneers in the evolution of the computer. Well, that concludes our discussion of the thinking machine episode. But we have a lot of history left, which we will talk about beginning with our next session, based upon the next in this series of episodes of The Machine That Changed the World.